Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Final Trade. Welcome back to the whiteboard for the first time in a little while. I finally got some actual lighting equipment, so we'll see how that works out, if it looks any better. So, following up to the video I made yesterday about Pokemon and how it's done really well and how we can expect it to do well in the future, and reading through some of the responses, I kind of had some ideas about something that might help some people understand why this is. Why do most of us think this way? Why is it that when we look at the TCG market and we bring over experiences from the stock market, whether we have a lot of experience or not much experience in the stock market, why do we sometimes misinterpret what is going to happen in the future in the TCG market? And how can we think a little more clearly about that? And something I want to specifically talk about is print runs as they compare to stock floats in the stock market. And so in the stock market, man, I hope I spell things right or I'll look stupid. Okay, in the stock market, you have a company. They go and they list themselves on an exchange and they issue shares. And so you will have a certain number of shares outstanding. Oh, there, I spelled it wrong. Okay. So a company will have a certain number of shares outstanding. And what that means is that, say, a company issued 100 million shares. It means there's 100 million of those shares out there. And companies will just issue as many as they want. Sometimes when companies list, they want to issue 10 million shares or 100 million. It doesn't matter. They take what they think the value of the company is, what they think initial investors will pay for it, and they divide it up into some number of shares. It's pretty arbitrary. But they will have a certain number of shares outstanding out in the market to be traded. And what do we have in the TCG market? What do we have that's analogous to that in the TCG market? We have the print run. Now, we have a certain number of boxes. There we go. Okay, so we get a certain number of boxes in the TCG market, and that's kind of analogous to shares outstanding in the stock market. And I know some of y'all will already be screaming at your monitor about how it's different, and don't worry, we'll get there. Now, we have a second concept that goes below shares outstanding, and that is the float. The float. And float is something that you don't get into very often in the stock market. It comes into play when you have things like people taking large short positions in a company. What the float is how many of these shares outstanding are available to be traded. And this is a very squishy definition because you'll have things like, say, pension funds that hold shares of a company, and they're really not there to be trading in and out of the market on a day-by-day basis. Pension funds will trade high returns for stability. What they want is absolute stability so that when the people paying into the pension fund get to retirement, there's money to pay out to them. And so we often consider that shares owned by pension funds are not part of the float. They are not available to be quickly bought and sold on the market. Most shares held by individuals are considered to be part of the float. Some shares held by mutual funds and other investment groups may or may not be considered part of the float, just depending on what the goals of that investment group are. So the float is what's available to be traded. And in the TCG market, you know, we're going to just have to make up a word for this. I've never seen anyone describe a word for this. We're just going to call it the boxes available. Available. There we go. Boxes available. So don't trip again. Okay. Now, in the TCG market, what does this mean? This means probably almost all boxes held by WotC, held by distributors, held by card stores, a lot of the boxes held by investors. And so most boxes are available because let's face reality here. If somebody's got an Adventures in the Forgotten Realms set booster box, do you think they're going all diamond hands on that thing? Not likely. There's probably a couple people who say, you know, in 20 years, I think that AFR set box, it'll just be worth an amazing amount. And they're holding with diamond hands. But for the most part, every AFR set box ever produced that was part of the print run and still exists is part of the boxes available. And now here's where people start to get confused, because so far this looks like a pretty good comparison. This looks nearly 1-to-1, kind of. I know there's some nuance here because companies can issue additional shares. The companies that control various games can go back and print more boxes. So that's a little bit alike. But companies will also buy up their own shares. They'll do stock repurchase programs if they have extra cash, or sometimes if they need to do things like they have employee compensation that gets paid in terms of shares, whether that be like stock option programs or that be 401k matching, things like that. Companies can go out for various reasons and buy their own shares out of the market and thus reduce the shares outstanding or maybe just lock them up so they're no longer in the float. And so the companies themselves that control these kind of sometimes interfere in the market in terms of buying up their own shares, which doesn't really happen over here. I mean, you don't see Legend Story Studios going out there and being like, you know what, we shouldn't have sold all those Welcome to Wraith boxes, and they go and they just buy up all of them. You don't see that happening. But something that happens here that does not happen in the stock market is attrition, just normal attrition. People open the boxes, and the boxes available turn into singles. And you have singles available. And those available singles, well, you know what? Some of them get locked up in decks and collections. Yeah, there are some people who collect Magic. Put them in binders, even modern sets. There are some. And so you can further reduce from just boxes available that are not held by the diamond hands. You can reduce those down, and there's this natural attrition, and you don't really have a natural attrition. You know, you have your float over here, which is kind of analogous to the boxes that are not being held for the long term, but you don't have a mechanism over here where shares of a company disappear. And that's something that's really missing, and I think that's missing from a lot of people's thought processes when they think about the TCG market, and they inadvertently compare it to what they already know about the stock market. And so they miss this part here, that the attrition has a huge long-term effect on prices, that when you start taking boxes and you open them and you open them and you open them and you rip packs and you make the singles and you sell the singles because maybe you're a box breaker, or maybe because you're looking to arbitrage the market in between singles and sealed boxes. And then if you're a singles buyer, you go out there and you buy singles, and you buy them maybe for decks, for your commander decks, for your collections, because you like the art, because you think it's a good quality example that should be graded or something else. All the reasons these things attrit out of the market. And that's something you don't see over here on the stock market side. And so I think this is the additional step that kind of people neglect to consider the effect of this over a long period of time, and that this will cause prices to go up and up and up. And that's why people are just continuously surprised. Everybody constantly, unconsciously recalibrates their thinking to this model. And it doesn't matter if, you have a normal corporate job and you have a 401k and it's passively managed and you don't know anything about stocks. You kind of understand these concepts. You definitely kind of understand this more intuitively than people kind of understand this. And so when they come into the TCG market, their frame of reference is not entirely correct. A lot of these concepts have analogs over in the TCG market, but they don't have one-to-one direct analogs. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused when people are maybe experts in some other part of collecting or dealing, or, when it comes to stamps or coins or toys or whatever. And then they come over to the TCG market and they try to apply those ideas one-to-one, and they don't stop and consider all the other minutiae of the TCG market and why it's different, why we have cards that fall out. We have boxes that turn into singles and can never turn back into boxes. And we have singles that get locked up in decks for long periods of time, not necessarily forever, but they can, for a material amount of time, be locked up and get locked up in collections forever. And cards that simply get damaged to the point that they really don't count in these numbers anymore. Because let's be realistic, if you have people dealing in cards that are, say, 5, 10, 15 years old, and you have damaged copies, well, there's got to be a significant discount on that. It's not the same product. It may be mechanically the same when you're playing the game, but it's not the same from a collecting and dealing standpoint and a market standpoint. And so I think this is something that we need to constantly ask ourselves, where are the similarities? So that if you do have a lot of experience in the stock market and you know a lot about how it works, how can you try to find the analogs over here? But you need to always be conscious of where there are differences also, and where you're going to run into problems if you just blindly think these are analogous and you don't stop and sit down and carefully consider where are the differences that materially affect the long-term outcomes of bets that you make in this market. Because this is definitely something that people neglect a lot. They don't stop to think that, hey, Fusion Strike is $88, but one day there will not be enough Fusion Strike. Monarch First Edition, one day there were 125,000 boxes of Monarch First Edition. And in the future, every day there will be fewer and fewer. The boxes get open, they naturally attrit, they get locked up by people who don't want to sell them, and the prices go up again and again and again. And that's really not something you see over here. What you see over here in the stock market is assets appreciate because underlying companies expand their operations, they increase margins, they do all these different activities. Stocks don't typically go up in price because the amount of stock disappears. That's not the leading effect, that's a minor effect. If a company goes on a years-long campaign of stock buybacks to put some of its profits into buying back its own stock, then yes, over time, its float and its shares outstanding both decrease, and that pushes the price up. But that's typically a minor effect in the stock market compared to how is the company actually using capital? What is it doing in terms of market share, profit margins, everything else? But over here in the TCG market, once a product goes out of print, then the biggest thing controlling what the long-term price action will be is how fast is it being opened. And this is going back to the video I made right after MetaZoo folded. This is the biggest thing why, as a TCG investor, you need to be investing in games that have active player bases. Because in the long term, that's what stimulates boxes to get opened. It's people who are nostalgic and want to open it for fun. It's people that maybe want to draft an old set and open it. It's people who want to arbitrage the difference between singles and sealed because there is a market for singles, because there are players. And to a small extent for most of these games, there are some collectors out there building collections, and that's stimulating boxes to be open. But when it's a stonk bro game like MetaZoo was, well, nobody wants to open those old boxes. And that's one of the many reasons why it failed. But that's why you need to be careful, and you need to find the games that actually have people wanting to open the boxes in the long term. So think about how you can think about these problems, how you can look at things that happen in the stock market, and how you can try to find the analogies over here in the TCG market, what they might mean, and how you may fool yourself if you don't think carefully enough, because there's a lot of nuance here. And this is one of the big drivers of long-term price appreciation that people regularly neglect in their analyses when they reflexively say, nah, Fusion Strike, it'll be $88 for eternity. When they say something like that, they're inadvertently missing something, but they may have trouble figuring out, how exactly is my thinking about this wrong, and why am I missing the thing that makes them unable to make a bet on Fusion Strike while it's cheap, and then 2 years later it's more than doubled in price. Contemplate this on the tree of woe.